This company can no longer carry your instability.
Darius Vale did not raise his voice when his wife ended their marriage in front of the board. They expected a man stripped of his titles to reach for whatever Vivian stood at the head of the table in her cream suit, ring already gone, while the divorce petition sat beside the termination letter. Instead, Darius reached into his jacket and placed an old brass key on the table, and almost laughable beside the legal folders that were supposed to erase him.
Security will escort you out.
Graham Peller told security to prepare his escort. Vivian called him unstable. No one noticed Celia Grant at the back wall, holding a tablet against her chest like she was guarding a secret. Then Darius asked one question that changed the air.
How much did Keystone offer you?
How much did Keystone offer you? Graham froze. Vivian turned pale.
What offer?
And when Darius placed the brass key in Celia's hand,
open Ruth's file.
The people who thought they were firing him began to understand something too late.
Absolutely not.
Before that boardroom learned what Ruth's file contained,
fire every one of them.
We need to return to the morning they mistook silence for defeat. The first document Vivian Vale slid across the boardroom table was not the termination letter. It was the divorce petition. Darius Vale looked at it without touching the page. Rain moved down the 31st floor windows of ValeBridge Systems, blurring Atlanta into gray streaks of glass, traffic, and morning light. 12 board members sat around the long walnut table. No one spoke. No one reached for the coffee. Even the company attorney kept his eyes lowered, as if the papers themselves were too personal to watch. Vivian stood at the head of the room in a cream suit, her hair smooth, her face calm, her wedding ring already gone. Darius, she said, this company can no longer carry your instability. Instability. That was what she called it when he questioned layoffs before Christmas. That was what she called it when he asked why warehouse health coverage had been cut while executive bonuses increased. That was what she called it when the quiet man who helped build her empire finally stopped nodding. The second document came next, a board resolution removing him from all executive duties, effective immediately. Darius read the first line, then the last. Then he looked at the woman who had once slept beside him on an air mattress in their first rented office because they could not afford a couch. 14 years of marriage, 20 years of work, reduced to 2 signatures and a legal folder. Graham Peller, the board chair, folded his with the practiced softness of a man who enjoyed cruelty more when it sounded professional. This has been handled with dignity, Graham said. Darius almost smiled. Some people only use the word dignity when they mean silence. They want you quiet while they take your name off the door. They want you grateful because they humiliated you in a boardroom instead of a hallway. They want your pain to sit straight, sign quickly, and leave without disturbing the furniture. But Darius did sign. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his charcoal suit and took out a small brass key attached to a dark leather tag. It was old, dull at the edges, rubbed smooth by years of being carried. He placed it gently on the table. The sound was small. Celia Grant heard it. Anyway, she stood near the back wall with a tablet pressed against her chest. Officially, she was Darius's assistant. Unofficially, she was the only person in that room who had noticed he walked in with no briefcase, no laptop, and no fear. Vivian glanced at the key. What is that? Darius did not answer her. Graham's mouth tightened. Security will escort you to your office after this meeting. You may collect personal items only. Company devices remain here. Access will be disabled within the hour. Within the hour. That was how long they thought it took to erase a man. Darius folded his hands. Who approved that? Vivian lifted her chin. I did. As CEO? Yes, as my wife. Her face hardened. That part is over. The room went still in a way that felt almost physical. Darius looked at her left hand again. The empty space where her ring had been hurt more than he expected. Not because he thought the marriage could be saved in this room. It had been ending for years in smaller ways. Missed dinners, locked phones, public jokes that cut too close. Interviews where she called ValeBridge my company, while he sat just outside the frame. Still, seeing the missing ring made the truth final. Vivian opened another folder. For the record, Mr. Vale has repeatedly interfered with executive decisions, challenged investor-approved strategy, and created a hostile decision-making environment. Hostile. Darius remembered the first office on Edgewood Avenue with stained ceiling tiles and a back door that stuck in summer heat. His mother, Ruth Brooks, had stood in that doorway holding that same brass key. "Son," she told him, "don't build anything you have to become cruel to protect." That was before ValeBridge had offices in 7 states, before Vivian's magazine covers, before the world learned her name and forgot his. Malcolm Pierce, the CF, shifted in his chair. His pen tapped once against his notebook, then stopped. He knew the numbers. He knew Darius had saved the company twice. But fear can make honest men study the table like it might forgive them. Darius looked at Vivian. "Did you read everything they asked you to sign? Do not patronize me." "I'm asking because once you sign certain things, Vivian, you cannot pretend you were misled." Graham leaned forward. "This emotional behavior is exactly why the board has concerns." Darius turned to him. "How much did Keystone offer you?" No one moved. Vivian's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Graham's face stayed controlled, but his hand tightened around the armrest. "I have no idea what you're implying," he said. Darius nodded slowly. "Then you won't mind opening the founder file." For the first time that morning, Vivian looked uncertain. Graham stood. "Absolutely not." Celia's grip tightened around her tablet. Darius picked up the brass key and held it in his palm. For 1 second, he saw his mother's hand, closing around his when she gave it to him. He heard her voice again, gentle but firm. "Some doors only open when you stop asking permission." He turned toward the back of the room. "Celia." Her eyes lifted. "Yes, Mr. Vale?" Vivian snapped out. "Celia, you may wait outside." Celia did not move. Darius walked to her slowly and placed the brass key in her hand. "Open Ruth's file," he said. Vivian's face lost color. Graham stepped away from his chair. "You are no longer authorized to give instructions here." Darius looked back at the table, at the people who believed they had gathered to remove a man who had already lost everything. Then he spoke quietly. "Fire every one of them." For 3 seconds, even the rain seemed to stop, because no one in that room understood yet that the old brass key was not sentimental. It was evidence 16 years earlier. ValeBridge Systems was not a glass tower with badge scanners and a lobby fountain. It was one rented room above a closed tailor shop on Edgewood Avenue. The carpet smelled like dust and old rain. The ceiling tiles had brown stains in the corners. In July, the air conditioner rattled like it was fighting for its life. In December, Darius and Vivian worked in coats because the heat clicked on only when it felt generous. Back then, Vivian was not yet the kind of woman who entered rooms with attorneys behind her. She was 25, hungry, brilliant, and afraid of wasting her life. Darius was 27, working nights as a systems analyst and spending his mornings building the operations platform that would later make ValeBridge valuable. He wrote code at a folding table with one short leg. He taped cardboard over the window when the sun hit his screen. He kept receipts in a shoebox because they could not afford an accountant. Vivian handled the pitch decks. Darius handled everything that made the promises true. At 2 in the morning, when Vivian's confidence broke, she would sit on the floor beside him and whisper, "What if nobody believes me?" Darius would turn the laptop toward her and say, "Then we build it so well they have no choice." That was how love sounded before power learned to interrupt it. The first real check did not come from an investor. It came from Ruth Brooks. Darius's mother arrived one rainy Tuesday wearing a lavender cardigan and carrying a grocery bag with pound cake inside. She looked around the office, saw the stained ceiling, the folding chairs, the exposed choirs near the wall, and smiled like she was looking at a cathedral. "So this is the dream," she said. Vivian laughed nervously. "It is not much yet." Ruth touched the desk with 2 fingers. "Most things are not much before somebody believes in them." Then she handed Darius a small envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $28,000. Darius stares at it. "Mama, no." "Yes," Ruth said. "You saved this." "I know what I saved. For your house repairs." She looked at him with that calm mother's use when they have already decided. A roof can be patched. A calling should be answered. Vivian began to cry before Darius did. Ruth pulled her close and told her, "Baby, if you lead, lead clean. Don't let applause make you forget the hands that held the ladder." A week later, they signed their first lease extension. Ruth gave Darius the brass key on a dark leather tag and told him never to lose it. He never did. In those early years, everyone knew who Darius was. Employees came to him when payroll glitched. Clients asked for him when a system crashed. Warehouse managers called him before they called executives because Darius answered the phone, even at midnight. But when ValeBridge began to grow, the world wanted a face. Vivian had the face. She was sharp on panels, graceful in interviews, fearless in investor meetings. Darius was proud of her, proud enough to step back when reporters asked for photos, proud enough to rewrite her speeches without asking for credit, proud enough to let the first magazine profile call him her supportive husband because he thought love did not need applause. At first, Vivian corrected people. "We built this together," she would say. Then she corrected them less. Then not at all. The first time she called ValeBridge, my company, on television. Darius was watching from the break room with Celia Grant, who had been hired 3 weeks earlier. Vivian said it smoothly. "My company." Celia glanced at Darius, waiting for him to react. He just smiled and said, "She earned her moment." Celia did not answer, but she remembered. That was the thing about Celia. She noticed what people gave away when they thought no one was keeping track. She noticed Darius eating cold vending machine sandwiches, while executives toasted expansion dinners downtown. She noticed him driving warehouse workers home after late shifts when MARTA service ended. She noticed Vivian's name going on awards for systems Darius had stayed up all night repairing, and she noticed the brass key. It sat in Darius's drawer beside old photographs, emergency cash, and a folded copy of the original founder agreement. Once, when Celia brought him a stack of contracts, she saw the document and teased him gently. "You keep the important things in strange places." Darius closed the drawer. Only the things people forget are important. If you have ever watched someone give everything and still be treated like they brought nothing, stay with this story. And tell me in the comments who taught you that quiet people are not weak. By the 10th year, ValeBridge had changed. The office became a headquarters. The headquarters became a tower. Investors arrived with expensive shoes and soft voices. They praised Vivian's vision and called Darius operationally cautious, which was boardroom language for inconvenient. Then Graham Peller appeared. He was charming in the way a locked door can look polished. He told Vivian she was bigger than the old story. He told her founders had to evolve. He told her companies failed when sentiment had too much authority. Darius saw the danger early, not because Graham was loud, because he was careful. He praised Darius in public and erased him in paperwork. He invited Vivian to private strategy dinners and called them leadership alignment sessions. He pushed for restructuring, acquisition talks, and a new governance model that made the company easier to sell. Vivian listened. Darius warned her. "He is not building with you," he said one night in their kitchen. "He is measuring what he can take." Vivian set down her glass. "You always think protection means saying no. And you always think ambition means trusting the person clapping loudest." That was the first night she slept in the guest room. 2 months later, Celia found something strange in a board packet. It was a scanned copy of a founder amendment with Darius's signature on the last page. Only Darius had not signed it. Celia stared at the page until the office lights clicked off above her. Then she opened Darius's old drawer. The brass key was still there, but the original founder agreement was gone. The missing founder agreement should have made Darius angry. Instead, it made him quiet. Celia found him that evening in the records room, beneath a flickering light, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened. Archive boxes lined the walls, payroll, leases, vendor contracts, insurance claims, the boring bones of a company. Darius respected boring things. Boring things kept people paid. Boring things proved who lied. Celia handed him the board packet. "Mr. Vale, this signature is not yours." His name sat there in blue ink, smooth and confident, close enough to fool anyone who had never watched him sign employee hardship checks, birthday cards, or notes to families. After layoffs, he could not stop. But Celia had watched. "You cross your V lower," she said, "and your D leans forward. This one leans back." Darius did not ask why an assistant noticed that. Ignored people often became experts in details because details were the only protection they had. What does the amendment do? It lets the board remove any founder deemed disruptive to strategic growth, Celia said. And it changes your protective voting rights into advisory rights. Advisory. That meant Darius could speak. It did not mean anyone had to listen. "Make 3 copies," he said. 1 paper, 2 digital, separate locations. Should we confront Vivian? No. She needs to know. She knows enough to ask questions. Celia lowered her eyes. Darius softened his voice. "Sometimes people do not need more information. They need less fear." Upstairs, Vivian was changing in ways she called growth. She stopped visiting operations unless guests were touring the building. A branding consultant told her not to say family company because it sounded small. Staff meetings became leadership briefings. People became headcount. Problems became optics. Graham loved the new language. "Speed matters more than comfort," he told the board. Then he proposed closing the Macon Support Center and outsourcing 300 jobs. Darius brought 12 pages proving the savings would vanish within 18 months because clients trusted the Macon team. Vivian barely looked at them. "The market rewards decisiveness," she said. "The market does not have to look those workers in the eye." Graham smiled. "That is your weakness, Darius. You are too emotionally close to the machinery. They are not machinery." "No," Graham said. "They are cost centers." Malcolm Pierce adjusted his glasses. "Actually, the churn risk is real." The room turned toward him. Graham's smile thinned. "Noted." After the meeting, Malcolm followed Darius into the elevator. For 10 floors, neither man spoke. Then Malcolm said, "They are building a file on you." "I know. You need counsel. I have counsel. Then use it." The doors opened, but Malcolm caught his arm gently. "You keep waiting for Vivian to remember who you are." Darius did not answer. Some truths hurt worse when spoken kindly. At home, the marriage had become a museum of things neither of them touched. Their wedding photo still sat on the console table. Ruth's peach cobbler recipe was still taped inside a kitchen cabinet. Darius's clothes were still in the main closet, though Vivian now slept with her phone face down and her laptop locked. One night, he found her at the dining table, with a folder marked by Graham's initials. Is that the governance amendment? Vivian closed it. It is not ready. Did you read the founder rights section? I am tired of being tested in my own house. Our house. She gave a tired, sharp laugh. That is exactly it. Everything has to be ours, so nothing can be mine. Darius stood still. I never wanted your light. No, she said. You just wanted to stand close enough that nobody could tell where it came from. The cruelty surprised them both. Vivian looked away first. The next morning, Celia found a manila envelope on her desk, no return name. Inside was a flash drive and a printed security log from the archive corridor. Graham Peller had entered the records room at 11:43 p.m. on May 6. The same night, the original founder agreement vanished. Celia walked 3 blocks in the rain to a coffee shop where no ValeBridge badge scanner could record her. When Darius answered, she said the files was not lost. A long silence followed. Then Darius asked, "Who else knows?" "No one. Keep it that way. If Graham took it, we can stop this now." "No," Darius said. "We cannot stop what we cannot fully prove." Celia looked down at the wet envelope in her lap. "Then what do we do?" Darius was quiet, so long she thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "We let them believe I am unprepared." And 2 weeks later, Vivian scheduled the meeting that would remove him. By the time Darius returned to the boardroom, the rain had hardened against the windows. Celia stood near the back wall with Ruth's brass key closed inside her palm. Graham remained on his feet, one hand braced on the table, his face controlled but his eyes sharp with warning. Vivian looked from Darius to Celia. "Open Ruth's file," she said. "What does your mother have to do with this?" Darius did not answer right away. He looked at the people around the table, many of whom had smiled beside him at ribbon cuttings, accepted his quiet help during crises, then sat there that morning while Graham called him unstable. Before Celia opens anything, Darius said, "I want the record to be clear." Graham gave a short laugh. "There is no record. This is an internal governance meeting." Malcolm Pierce finally lifted his head. "There is a record," he said. Everyone turned. Malcolm touched the small recorder beside his notebook. "Per board policy, removal proceedings involving a founder officer require audio documentation." Graham's face tightened. That policy was suspended. "No," Malcolm said. "It was proposed for suspension. It was never adopted." Darius looked at Malcolm for the first time with something close to gratitude. A small shift moved through the room. Not enough to save anyone. Enough to make the comfortable people sit straighter. Vivian pressed her fingers against the table. "Fine. Let the record show that Darius has created repeated delays in essential restructuring." "Which restructuring?" Darius asked. "The Macon Support Center, the Kansas Warehouse, the Community Service Division." "Say the number." Vivian's eyes narrowed. Darius waited. Malcolm answered quietly. 487 employees. The number changed the air. 487 was not a strategy. It was parents, rent payments, prescriptions, school shoes, car notes, lunch bags packed before sunrise. Darius leaned forward. "I delayed those layoffs because the savings projection was false." Graham cut in.
"That is your opinion."
"No," Malcolm said. Graham turned slowly toward him. Malcolm swallowed once, then opened a folder. The first model excluded rehiring fees, client penalties, training losses, and contract churn. When those are included, the layoffs save money for 2 quarters and create losses by month 9. Vivian stared at him. "You never told me that. I sent the revised model to Graham's office." Graham's voice cooled. "You sent a draft. I sent a signed financial review." The attorney beside Graham shifted in his chair. Darius watched Vivian absorb the first crack in the story she had trusted. For a second, he saw the younger woman from Edgewood Avenue, the one who feared being dismissed, the one who wanted proof before pride hardened her. Then she looked away from Malcolm and back to Darius. Even if the model was complicated, you had no right to undermine executive direction. I did not undermine it. I asked who would be harmed by it. Graham tapped the table once. And that is why you are no longer fit. You cannot lead at scale if every decision becomes a personal rescue mission. Darius's voice stayed calm. A company that grows by throwing away the people who built it is not scaling. It is consuming itself. No one spoke. Outside, thunder rolled low over the city. Graham sat down slowly, as if reclaiming control by moving less. "This is sentimental theater," he said. "The board has already reviewed Mr. Vale's conduct." "Then review mine," Darius said. Vivian blinked. Darius turned to Malcolm. "Read the emergency payments from the winter outage." Malcolm hesitated, then opened another page. In January, during the server failure, Darius Vale declined his quarterly bonus and redirected $186,000 to temporary payroll coverage for hourly staff. A board member near the window frowned. "That was his money?" Malcolm nodded. "Yes." Darius said nothing. Malcolm continued. "In 2021, he personally guaranteed the equipment lease that kept the Kansas warehouse operating. In 2022, he delayed his own compensation for 5 months during the hospital client dispute." Vivian's expression changed slightly with each sentence. Not shock exactly. Recognition. She had known pieces. She had not wanted to hold the whole picture at once. Graham closed the folder in front of him. "None of that changes today's authority." "No," Darius said, "but it explains why you needed me gone before Keystone's offer became public." This time Vivian stood. "What offer?" Graham's jaw tightened. "There is no active offer requiring board discussion." Darius looked at Celia, unlocked her tablet and turned it toward the table. Keystone Capital sent a preliminary acquisition letter 11 days ago. It included retention bonuses for selected executives and board members after workforce reduction. Vivian whispered, "Selected executives?" Celia looked at her, not cruelly. "Yes, Mom, your name was included." Vivian's face went still. For years, she had trained herself not to show surprise in rooms full of men who waited for women to look uncertain. But this was not uncertainty. This was the first moment she seemed to understand that being used can feel like being chosen until the invoice arrives. Graham rose again. "Ms. Grant, you are far outside your role." Celia's hand trembled, but her voice did not. "My role was to maintain Mr. Vale's executive records. Those records were altered." The attorney leaned forward. "That is a serious allegation." "Yes," Celia said. "It is." Darius picked up the brass key from her open palm and placed it on the table between the folders. "Then, let's get serious." Vivian looked at the key as if it had become heavier. Darius said, "Brooks gave me that key the week this company almost died before it began. Her file contains the original founder agreement, the trust documents, and one page Graham does not want read aloud." Graham's voice dropped. "Darius, I strongly advise you to stop." Darius turned to him. "You advised my wife to divorce me before breakfast and fire me before lunch. I think I have heard enough of your advice." A sound moved through the boardroom. Not laughter, not approval, recognition. For the first time all morning, Darius was not the man being removed. He was the man asking why a page was missing. And Malcolm Pierce, who had spent too many years choosing caution, pushed his glasses back into place and said, "I would also like to know why page 7 is missing from the founder file." Celia had been underestimated in that building for 6 years. People handed her coffee cups they had not asked her to carry. They spoke around her in elevators. They left folders open on conference tables because they believed an assistant could organize information but not understand it. That morning, every one of those mistakes returned to the boardroom wearing her face. Graham pointed at her tablet. "Where did you get that acquisition letter?" Celia held it closer to her chest. From the executive records system. You had no authority to access board materials. I had authority to maintain Mr. Vale's files. Keystone was not his file. Darius looked at Graham. It became mine when you used it to remove me. Vivian lowered herself back into her chair. The room had shifted too quickly. 10 minutes earlier, she had been the woman in control. Now she was reading faces, measuring silence, trying to understand which truth had been hidden from her and which truth she had chosen not to see. Celia, Vivian said carefully, did Darius ask you to spy on the board? No. Then why did you save those documents? Celia's eyes moved to Darius for half a second, then back to Vivian, because somebody was changing records. The attorney beside Graham opened his mouth, but Malcolm spoke first. Let her finish. Graham turned on him. You are making a mistake. Malcolm's voice stayed low. I made the mistake years ago. Today I am correcting it. Celia touched the side of her tablet. The main boardroom screen lit up with a file path, a date stamp, and a signature page. This amendment was uploaded on May 7th at 12:16 a.m. It states that Mr. Vale agreed to surrender protective voting rights. Vivian stared at the screen. That is his signature. No, Mom, Celia said. It is an image of his signature. The difference seemed small until it was not. Celia opened a second file. This is Mr. Vale's real signature from a lease guarantee in 2021. The V crosses low. The D leans forward. The amendment signature leans back. The spacing is wrong. Graham laughed once, cold and dismissive. You are not a handwriting expert. No, Celia said. I am the person who has watched him sign documents for 6 years. The room went quiet again, not because her proof was complete, because her certainty was. Darius studied Celia's face. He remembered the day he hired her, sitting across from a young woman who had been passed over twice at another company because, as one manager put it, she was excellent, but not visible leadership material. Darius had asked her what she wanted. She had said, a place where accuracy matters. He had promised her that. Now she was risking everything because it had stopped being true. Vivian folded her hands tightly. If there was a forged amendment, why didn't you bring it to me? Celia's expression softened, but only a little. I tried. Vivian blinked. 3 times, Celia said. I requested a private meeting. Your office declined twice. The 3rd time, Mr. Peller's assistant replied that governance concerns should be directed to the board chair. Vivian looked toward Graham. Graham did not look back. Darius saw the pain cross her face. He did not enjoy it. That surprised him. After everything, he had expected some part of him to feel satisfaction. But grief does not become joy just because truth arrives. Celia reached beneath the credenza and pulled out a gray archive box sealed with red evidence tape. A handwritten label sat across the top, Ruth Brooks. Vivian whispered the name like it belonged to another life. Darius stepped closer to the table. My mother believed a company needed a conscience before it needed a valuation. Graham's chair creaked as he sat back down. This is absurd. No, Darius said. Absurd was thinking I kept that key for nostalgia. Celia placed the box on the table. Her hands trembled now. She did not hide it. I need the board to understand something, she said. If I open this, I will likely lose my job. Darius turned to her. Not if the documents say what I believe they say. And if they do not, then you still told the truth. That was the answers that steadied her. Celia broke the tape. Inside were old folders, a yellowed lease, Ruth's cashier's check copy, original incorporation papers, and a sealed legal envelope addressed to Darius Vale and Amani Brooks. Vivian's eyes moved to the cashier's check, $28,000. The first money ValeBridge ever survived on. She reached toward it, then stopped before touching the paper. I forgot, she said softly. Darius answered with no anger in his voice. No. You remembered when it was beautiful. You forgot when it became inconvenient. Celia opened the legal envelope and removed a document with blue tabs along the side. Founder Protection Trust. Malcolm read aloud. The attorney leaned forward so sharply his glasses slipped. Darius looked around the room. When ValeBridge almost failed in its first year, my mother invested her savings. My sister drafted a trust to protect the company from being sold or gutted without worker impact review, founder consent, and independent audit. Graham's mouth tightened. That trust expired. No, Darius said. You needed everyone to think it did. Celia flipped to the final page. Page 7, Malcolm said. Vivian stood slowly. Read it. Graham's voice sharpened. I object. Darius looked at him. This is not a courtroom, Graham. You said so yourself. Celia's breath caught as she scanned the page. Then her face changed, not triumph, shock. She looked at Darius. He nodded once. Celia read aloud. In the event of attempted unlawful removal of a protected founder, document tampering, concealed acquisition negotiation, or board action intended to bypass employee protection review, temporary authority transfers to the founder protection trustee until investigation is complete. A board member near the window whispered, "Who is the trustee?" Celia looked down at the page. Then the boardroom doors opened. Amani Brooks walked in wearing a black pantsuit, rein on her shoulders, and a leather folder under one arm. Behind her stood Nora Whitcomb, the night facility supervisor, holding an old handwritten logbook against her chest. Imani looked at Graham first, then Vivian, then her brother. The trustee, she said, is standing right here. Nora Whitcomb did not look like a woman who could frighten a boardroom. She was 62, short, steady, and wearing a Navy facilities uniform with a raincoat folded over one arm. Her silver curls were damp at the edges. Her black work shoes squeaked once against the polished floor as she stepped inside. Several board members looked at her the way people look at someone they have passed for years without seeing. Darius saw that too. He had known Nora since the second ValeBridge office. She worked nights, fixed small problems before executives noticed them, and kept a handwritten logbook because, as she once told him, machines forget when people want them to. Paper has a better conscience. Graham's face hardened. What is this? He asked. Imani Brooks placed her leather folder on the table. This is testimony relevant to document tampering. The company attorney stood. Mrs. Brooks, this meeting is closed. Imani smiled without warmth. Not anymore. Under the Founder Protection Trust, any attempted removal tied to altered records triggers trustee review. I am legal counsel to the trustee. Vivian stared at her. Darius is the trustee? No, Imani said. She turned slightly toward Darius. Ruth Brooks named both of her children as successor trustees. Darius refused to activate his authority unless there was proof. I did not. That sentence moved through the room like a door opening. Graham looked at Nora. And what exactly does a facility supervisor have to add? Darius's eyes narrowed. Nora lifted her chin. The truth, she said. No one laughed. Imani opened the folder. Mrs. Whitcomb, where were you on May 6 at 11:43 p.m.? Nora opened her logbook. Her fingers were thick from years of work, but they moved carefully over the page. 31st floor archive corridor, water leak near the east utility closet. I was waiting on maintenance, and who entered the records room? Nora looked directly at Graham. Mr. Peller. Graham gave a controlled sigh. I have every right to access corporate records. At midnight? Malcolm asked. Graham ignored him. Nora continued. He came with another man I did not recognize. The man carried a black scanner case. Mr. Peller told me the archive area was off limits for cleaning that night. Vivian turned toward Graham. You never told me this. Graham's voice stayed smooth. Because it was routine. Nora's eyes did not move. Routine people do not put documents inside their coat. The room tightened. Graham leaned back. You expect this board to rely on memory from a janitor? The word landed ugly. Darius stood. He did not shout. He did not need to. Her name, he said, is Nora Whitcomb. For the first time all morning, Graham looked almost amused. Fine. From Mrs. Whitcomb. Nora closed the logbook with both hands. I have been called worse by better men. A quiet breath passed through the room. Amani placed a printed security still on the table. It showed Graham near the archive door, one hand on the frame, the other holding a folder close to his side. Mrs. Whitcomb's log matches badge access, hallway footage, and the upload time of the altered amendment, Amani said. It also matches the night the original page 7 disappeared from the digital file. The company attorney stopped taking notes. Vivian sat very still. Darius could see her putting the story together piece by piece. Graham's advice, the sudden governance push. The private dinners, the pressure to sign quickly. The divorce filing timed with the removal vote. She had not created every lie, but she had accepted the lies that served her. That was harder to defend. Nora reached into her coat pocket and removed a small plastic evidence sleeve. Inside was a folded yellow slip. I found this near the archive copier after Mr. Peller left, she said. I kept it because Mr. Darius always told us to report anything strange. But when I tried to report it, security said the issue was above my level. Amani took the sleeve and passed it to Malcolm. Malcolm read it, and his face changed. It is a scanner receipt, he said. Same timestamp, 23 pages. Darius looked at Graham. The founder agreement was 23 pages. Vivian whispered, Graham. He turned on her at last. Do not start pretending innocence now. You wanted him out as much as anyone. The sentence struck harder than any denial. Vivian's eyes filled, but no tears fell. Darius looked away. There are moments when justice arrives holding a mirror, and nobody likes what it reflects. Imani opened the trust document to page 7. Temporary trustee authority is active, she said. The board cannot remove Darius Vale today. The Keystone talks are suspended. Any executive or board member involved in concealment, forged authorization, or bypassing worker impact review is subject to immediate removal pending investigation. Graham gave a cold laugh. You do not have the votes. Darius picked up Ruth's brass key from the table. You still think this is about votes? He walked to Nora and placed the key in her hand for 1 second. Thank you for keeping the door from closing. Nora's face softened. Your mama told me once that records are just memories with better shoes. For the first time that day, Darius almost smiled. Then Amani turned to Celia. Grant, please open the emergency governance file. Celia connected her tablet to the screen. A list appeared, barred members, executives, approval chains, hidden communications, Keystone retention bonuses. Names began to appear in red. Vivian's name was not first. Graham's was, and beside it was one phrase that made even the attorney step back from the table. Recommended immediate removal for cause. For a moment, Graham Peller looked smaller than his suit, not weak, not sorry, just exposed. The screen at the front of the boardroom showed his name in red beside a trail of dates, approvals, private messages, and payment schedules. Keystone Capital's offer had not been formal enough for public announcement, but it had been real enough for promises. Retention bonus, board advisory fee, post-acquisition consulting agreement. Those words looked clean until everyone understood what they had been purchased with. 487 jobs, a forged amendment, a founder removed before he could stop it. Vivian stared at the screen as if the light from it was burning her. You told me. Keystone was exploratory, she said. Graham did not look at her. It was. You told me the layoffs were necessary. They were. Malcolm pushed his chair back. No, Graham. They were convenient. That was the first time Malcolm's voice filled the room without apology. Graham turned on him. You should be careful. Malcolm removed his glasses and placed them on the table. I have been careful for 15 years. It did not make me honorable. It made me useful. The words landed with a quiet force. Darius looked at him, and Malcolm gave the smallest nod, not asking for forgiveness yet, only acknowledging that the truth had arrived late but alive. Amani stepped closer to the screen. Under the Founder Protection Trust, temporary authority is now active. Darius Vale and I, as successor trustees, have the power to suspend any officer, executive, or board member connected to this unlawful removal attempt until an independent investigation is complete. Graham laughed through his nose. You are bluffing. Amani opened another document. No.
I am reading.
The company attorney leaned over the page, and the color drained from his face in slow degrees. Vivian noticed. What is it? She asked. The attorney did not answer quickly enough. Darius did. Page 7. Celia advanced the screen. There it was. The page Graham had tried to bury. The page Vivian had never asked to see. The page Ruth Brooks' insisted on, when she gave her son the money that saved the dream before anyone else believed in it. A founder could not be removed during an active concealed acquisition negotiation without employee impact review, independent audit, and consent from the protection trustees. If the board attempted it through alt records, emergency authority transferred immediately. Vivian whispered, Ruth did this? Darius looked at her. Ruth protected what we were too young to know people would try to steal. The room fell into a kind of silence that did not feel empty anymore. It felt full of a woman who was no longer alive. A woman in a lavender cardigan who had never sat at that walnut table but had somehow reached across all those years and placed her hand on it. Graham's face twisted. This company is not a memorial to your mother. Darius's eyes hardened for the first time that day. No, he said, it is not. But it will not become a graveyard for everyone else's livelihood, just so you can cash out clean. Celia stood near the screen, still holding her tablet. Her hand was steady now. Amani looked at Darius. The file is ready. Everyone seemed to understand that a line had been reached. Darius could humiliate them if he wanted to. He could make the moment theatrical. He could list every insult, every stolen credit, every dinner where Vivian praised investors while he answered emergency calls in the hallway. He did none of that. That was what made the room afraid. He turned to Celia. Proceed. Graham slammed his palm on the table. You do not have the authority? Darius looked at him with a calm so deep it felt final. I did not ask for authority today. I brought proof of the authority you tried to steal. Celia read from the screen. Graham Peller suspended from the board pending independent investigation. All company access revoked immediately. The security director near the door, who had been silent since the meeting began, touched his earpiece. Graham looked at Vivian then, not for love, not even alliance, but as a man searches for the person he believes still owes him obedience. Vivian, he said, stop this. Vivian did not move. Maybe she finally understood that Graham had never seen her as powerful. Only useful. Only polished enough to sell the plan. Celia continued. 2 board members who had approved the hidden retention agreement were suspended. The general counsel who had allowed the altered amendment into the packet was placed on administrative leave. The restructuring committee was dissolved. Keystone talks were frozen. The employee layoff notices scheduled for Monday were canceled before they could be sent. One by one, the red names on the screen became consequences. Not vengeance, consequences. Then Celia paused. Vivian's name appeared. No one breathed. Darius looked at his wife, the woman who had removed her ring before he even entered the room. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Are you going to fire me too? He held her gaze. The answer mattered less to the company than it did to whatever remained between them as human beings. You signed the removal packet, he said. You ignored warnings. You accepted a story because it gave you what you wanted. Her mouth trembled once, but she forced herself still. Yes, the word was small. It was also the first thing she had said all morning that sounded completely true. Darius looked toward Imani, then Malcolm, then Nora, then Celia. Finally, he turned back to Vivian. You are suspended as CEO pending review. A faint sound escaped her, almost a breath, almost breaking. But I will not destroy your name to satisfy my pain, he said. The investigation will decide what you did. Your own choices will decide what remains of you. Vivian lowered her eyes. Graham stepped away from the table as security entered. This is a mistake, he said. Nora Whitcomb, still holding her logbook, looked at him and answered softly, No, sir. The mistake was thinking nobody wrote things down. For the first time all day, someone almost laughed. Grant was escorted out past the very employees he had planned to discard. Through the glass wall, Darius watched assistants, analysts, coordinators, and managers stand frozen in the hallway. Sensing that something had shifted, but not yet knowing their lives had been spared, Celia turned off the screen. Darius picked up Ruth's brass key. The title of the morning had changed. It was no longer the day his wife fired him. It was the day the people who tried to erase him learned that silence had been keeping records. By 5 o'clock that evening, the rain had stopped. Atlanta still looked washed and bruised through the glass, but light had begun to break between the clouds. In the lobby of ValeBridge Systems, employees stood in small groups with phones in their hands, whispering over half-known facts. Graham Peller had been escorted out. The Keystone deal was frozen. The layoff notices were canceled. Vivian Vale had left the building through the private elevator, with no cameras, no speech, and no one rushing behind her to tell her she was still in control. Darius did not celebrate. That disappointed some people. They expected him to walk through the halls like a man who had won a war. They expected a smile, sharp enough to cut. They expected revenge to look louder than humiliation. But Darius had never wanted a throne. He had wanted the company to remember its soul before it sold it. He stood alone in the old records room, holding Ruth's brass key. The air smelled like paper, dust, and metal shelves. Somewhere above him, the building hummed with expensive lights and nervous machines. But in that small room, he could almost hear the first office again. The rattling air conditioner, Vivian laughing over bad coffee, his mother's soft shoes crossing the floor. Imani found him there. You did the right thing, she said. Darius looked at the key in his palm. Did I? You saved people's jobs. You exposed a crime. You stopped them from stealing what Mama protected. He nodded, but his eyes stayed heavy. That is not what I asked. Imani stepped beside him. For a while, they stood shoulder to shoulder the way they had as children at their kitchen sink, strying plates after Sunday dinner. Finally, Imani said, doing the right thing does not mean it will not hurt. Darius closed his hand around the key. That was the part people rarely understood. Justice could clear your name and still leave an empty chair at home. Truth could expose betrayal and still not give back the years you spent explaining someone else's greatness while they forgot yours. Later that night, Vivian called. Darius let the phone ring twice before answering. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Vivian said, I went back to the Edgewood office. Darius looked out at the dark city. It's a furniture store now. I know, I sat in the parking lot. Her voice sounded different without an audience. Smaller, more human, maybe more honest. I remembered your mother bringing that pound cake, Vivian said. I remembered her telling me not to forget the hands that held the ladder. Darius said nothing. Vivian swallowed. I forgot anyway. The apology was near, but not yet whole. Darius could hear her reaching for it, walking around it, afraid that once she said it clearly, she would have to live under its weight. I was angry at you, she continued. Not because you held me back. Because every time people praised me, some part of me knew you had carried more than they would ever see. And instead of being grateful, I felt exposed. Darius closed his eyes. That truth hurt because it sounded real. I am sorry, she said at last, not for getting caught, not for Graham, for making you smaller so I could feel taller. The room grew quiet around him. There was a time when those words would have opened every locked door inside him. He would have rushed toward repair. He would have mistaken her regret for restoration. But healing is not the same as returning. I forgive you, Darius said. Vivian broke then. He could hear it in her breathing. But I cannot be your husband anymore. The silence on the other end was long. I know, she whispered. When the call ended, Darius did not feel free all at once. Freedom rarely arrives like thunder. Sometimes it comes like a tired man, placing an old key in his pocket and realizing he no longer has to prove the door was his. 3 months later, ValeBridge changed in ways no press release could fully explain. The independent investigation confirmed Graham's document tampering and hidden acquisition arrangement. He resigned from 2 other boards before reporters even finished asking questions. The general counsel was removed. 2 board members settled quietly. Keystone withdrew its offer. Vivian cooperated with the investigation. She lost the CEO title, kept no board seat, and disappeared from public view for a while. Some called that downfall. Darius called it consequence. Malcolm Pierce became interim chief executive, but only after insisting on a worker council with real review power. He told the staff on his first day, I spent too many years being careful. I would like to spend the rest being useful in a better way. People believed him because his voice shook when he said it. Celia Grant became chief integrity officer. At her first company meeting, she stood behind a simple podium and told the employees, accuracy matters most when powerful people are uncomfortable with it. The room stood for her. Nora Whitcomb tried to refuse recognition, but Darius would not allow it. ValeBridge renamed the records room the Nora Whitcomb Archive. On the plaque beneath her name were the words she had spoken in the boardroom. Paper has a better conscience. Nora cried when she saw it, then pretended she had dust in her eye. As for Darius, he did not return to the old corner office. He moved into a smaller room near operations, where people came by without appointments, and nobody needed permission to tell the truth. On his desk sat 3 things: a framed photo of Ruth, the original cashier's check copy, and the brass key on its dark leather tag. Every morning, before opening his laptop, he touched the key once, not for luck, for memory, because his mother had been right. You should not build anything you have to become cruel to protect. But she had also known something else. You cannot protect anything honest by letting dishonest people call your silence ace. Peace. One Friday evening, Darius walked through the lobby as the cleaning crew arrived. The marble floors reflected the last gold light of sunset. A young analyst held the elevator for him and said, Mr. Vale, is it true you could have used that trust years ago? Darius smiled gently. Yes, why didn't you? He looked toward the front doors where employees were leaving for the weekend with lunch bags, backpacks, tired shoulders, and ordinary lives that had almost been treated like numbers. Because power used too early can look like fear, he said. But power used too late can become regret. The analyst thought about that and nodded slowly. Outside, the evening air smelled like wet pavement and magnolia trees. Darius stepped onto the sidewalk alone, but not empty. He had lost a marriage. He had lost the version of love he once defended long after it stopped defending him. But he had not lost himself, and sometimes that is the victory people cannot understand until they have survived being erased. The next Monday, the company lobby opened with no photographers, no headlines, no speeches, just workers coming in. Badges clicking, elevators rising, a building still standing because a quiet man, a loyal assistant, a brave sister, a careful CFO, and a night supervisor with a paper logbook refused to let greed have the final word. And on the 31st floor, inside a drawer that no longer needed to hide anything, Ruth Brooks's brass key rested in the dark, not as a weapon, not as revenge, as proof that the people others overlook are often the ones holding the door. If this story reminded you of someone who was underestimated, overlooked, or erased, until the truth finally spoke for them, honor them in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to remember that silence is not the same as defeat, and follow Hush Stories for more stories about dignity, truth, and emotional justice.